Well, good morning, Community Alliance. It's a real privilege to be here with you. Kind of just being here takes me back in time a bit. 2013, I was part of the leadership team at Pine Knolls Alliance Church up in South Glens Falls, and we had heard that the future for Community Alliance was uncertain. And so we began to enter into a relationship with the leaders who were present here at that time, along with the district, in order to see this church strengthened and be able to be a viable witness here in the community. And by God's grace, we have seen God do great things. Would you agree with me on that? It's really special to be here. And in the process, not just of refurbishing the church, but really to form relationships that will last for all of eternity. As I said, I was a senior pastor at Pine Knolls Alliance Church in South Glens Falls. I served as the senior pastor there for 20 years. I stepped away from that role about a year ago, so I'm in a process of transition myself. I have been working with Pastor Aaron over this last year as he has stepped into the role of senior pastor here, and I just think that Pastor Aaron and Bonnie are doing a phenomenal job here. I've got to tell you. He's faced some challenges that are unusual. Would you agree with me on that? With all this whole COVID-19, I said to him, and I try not to say it too often to discourage him, but I tell him, boy, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be trying to lead a congregation during these times. It would mean learning a whole new skill set, and I just think he has done a great job, not just of doing what happens on Sunday morning, but in terms of really cultivating a sense of community. And I know that so many of you, as leaders here and engaged participants, that you are a significant part in that as well. Let me just say that not having the opportunity to preach regularly means that I've got about 20 messages stored up for this morning, okay? And there are all sorts of issues that I'd like to speak into. We are going to get to the passage here in Matthew chapter 16 that Tom read just a few moments ago, but as we're navigating this whole thing with COVID-19, I think of another issue that's coming down the pipe pretty quickly, and that's the election in 2020 here, this November. And my words to you as a congregation are just that you not forget who you are. That long before you were a Democrat, long before you were a Republican, long before you were an independent, or maybe I should say more importantly than any of those things, you are the church. Amen? And that as followers of Christ, that must be our primary identity. And it must shape what we say or what we do. Because I've got to tell you, America, it doesn't need a stronger Republican Party, and it doesn't need a stronger Democrat Party. What it needs is a stronger, united church of Jesus Christ. And so I know that doesn't change necessarily your perspectives on any issue, given issue, but I want to remind you that as we navigate these coming months, not to forget who you are and whose you are. All right, enough said about that, okay? Let's jump into Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 6, Tom read it there. Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's giving them some instructions. It's familiar words. Let's just kind of give you a little bit of context to this passage. Before Jesus talks about denying yourself and taking up your cross and following him, he has, just prior to that in Matthew, it's recorded where Jesus begins to ask his disciples who they think he is. And Peter has this famous confession, right? Peter's confession of Christ is what we name that. And Peter says to him, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God." And Jesus goes on to affirm him and affirm what he has said. Not to deny it, not to redirect him, but to receive these incredible words that Peter has spoken. Jesus goes on to say that he's going to be killed and that he will be raised to life again. And Peter, in response to that now, gets it all wrong. As right as he was before, this is how wrong he is. He says to Jesus, "Never. That's just not going to happen. That's not going to happen." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." In other words, you're speaking from a place that is not truth. That's a lie of what you're saying. And so just get out of my way and let me stay focused on what needs to happen. And then Jesus goes into this passage and he says, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself He must take up his cross and he must follow me. Now, one of the things that I'm going to talk about today, and kind of set this as a preface, is that oftentimes we take passages from Scripture and there are parts of our understanding that are solid. They are true, they are right, they are good. But oftentimes woven into that, we have some other ideas that get woven into that, into our understanding of that passage, and it changes the way that we approach not only that passage, but it changes the way we approach life, and it changes the way that we relate to God. I want to talk a little bit about these verbs that Jesus uses in this passage. First of all, he says, we must deny ourselves. Now, when I hear that word, deny ourselves, what comes to my mind is that I've just finished an incredible meal, okay? And I've just had a really good main course and a side dish, and I've had maybe some good bread because I really like bread, you know. And there's been some good vegetables in there, and then we get to the dessert, and I have the dessert. Okay, one of my favorites is pecan pie. All right. And so I eat some pecan pie, and then I get to the second, and I say to myself, boy, that was so good. I would love a second piece of pie, but I'm going to deny myself, right? Isn't that what we say to ourselves? Or, you know, I'd really like to, and it's something good, but we say to ourselves, it's not that good for me, so I'm going to deny myself. I'm going to deny that desire. I'm going to deny that longing, okay, that I have. And would you agree with me that we all have experienced unholy desires? Anybody with me on that one, huh? An unholy desire that it's right and good for us to say, you know what, I'm going to deny myself in terms of pursuing that, right? It's good that we say no to those desires. But would you also agree with me that not all desires are unholy? See, sometimes we get ourselves in a spot where we almost have this sense that this longing is too big, and that somehow or another, if we pursue it, that it's going to lead us away from following after Christ. But God plants in our hearts desires that are born by His Spirit. He gives us a longing, isn't that right? To be in a meaningful relationship or to have a meaningful vocation, to make a difference in our world, to explore the gifts and the abilities that we have been given by God. Those are desires that we don't honor God when we deny them. We honor God when we pursue them, when we step into them, and we chase after them. You see, we misunderstand Jesus' words when we equate denying ourselves with saying no to all of our desires. Let's talk a little bit about taking up our cross. That's the second thing that Jesus says. Jesus says we must deny ourselves, and then we must take up our cross. I think it's hard for us living in the 21st century, growing up in a Christian culture, for us to understand just how unusual it is for the cross to be so prominent in a culture. We see people wearing earrings that have a cross, isn't that right? We see people who have a cross on a necklace. We have people who have tattooed a cross on their arm or their thigh or their back or whatever, okay? They wear the cross, and the cross has a certain significance for us, and for us it has a certain beauty to it, because we know that it was through the cross and through Jesus' blood shed on the cross that we have been made right with Him. And so I understand the beautiful part about it. But we have to understand also that the cross, for people living particularly in the first and second centuries, the cross was an instrument of death. And not just any death, a death that was designed to be so painful, so excruciating, that anybody who walked by someone who had been crucified, they would say to themselves, I will never, ever do anything that would ever raise the possibility for me to end up there. That's not where I want to go. It was intended to be the ultimate deterrent to crime in the Roman world. And so when we hear the words that we must take up our cross, when we rightly understand the cross, and we hear it in that sense, we understand that the cross is associated with pain. Isn't that right? And oftentimes, when we hear Jesus' words coming to us through the words of Scripture that we must take up our cross, we often associate that as our willingness to say yes to the pain of life. And in many ways, there's a truth to that. That if we are to follow Christ, we cannot be in a spot where we stick our heads in the sand and deny the pain of life. Would anybody agree with me that to live is to experience pain? Huh? If you don't think that, and if you're not there, talk to me about that after the service, okay? I'd love to hear about your life, okay? I really would. All too often, we find people in our culture who are trying to run away from pain. But to be a Christian and to have a biblical worldview is to understand that pain is woven into the very fabric of life. And we must be willing to face it and work through it and come to God in the midst of it. But my concern when we hear these words, we must take up our cross, is not so much that we simply accept the reality of pain in our life, but it's that we actually have a bias toward pain. That when there are two choices, and one is easier and has more pleasure involved in it, and there's another that is harder and has pain woven into it, it's been my experience that there are some in the Christian church who actually have a bias toward pain, that somehow or another, that God is going to bless them more if they willingly step into that place of pain. It's an interesting thing in our world right now, isn't it? Because in the Christian church there is this movement. We call it the prosperity gospel, right? Or we call it the name it and claim it, kind of groups within our culture, within the Christian church in America. And these are folks that want to deny pain. They want to push it away. There's something wrong in your life if you are experiencing pain. And that's not truth. But on the other hand, there are groups within the Christian church in America that come out of the holiness movement, and wonderful things about that, and a wonderful heritage in that. But there's almost this bias toward pain, that somehow or another God is more present if your life is painful, that you're walking more closely with God if you've chosen the path of hardship. It's not unusual for me to talk to people and they say, you know what, I'd really love to do this in the church, but, I was asked to do this other thing and it's not my preference, but I needed to say yes out of obedience. And they've equated obedience with doing simply that thing that they don't want to do, that thing that's hard, that thing that's painful. Because to them, that's what it means to take up your cross. Jesus says you must deny yourself, you must take up your cross, you must follow me. This image of following in the footsteps of Jesus is really a wonderful image, isn't it? There's a guy by the name of Ray Vanderlyn. He writes this series called In the Dust of the Rabbi, and he uses that as kind of this picture of staying so close to Jesus that when he walks through the dusty roads of Israel, that the dust that gets stirred up actually ends up on his followers. And I don't know, I just carry that image with me because it's something that, I aspire to. I want to be that close to Jesus. I want to be in the dust of the rabbi. I want to be so close to him that I'm able to experience His very presence. Following Jesus in our culture, though, is different because we don't get to see Him. We don't see the dust stirred up by His sandals. We don't smell Him. Can I even go so far as to say that? Is that all right to say in church, huh? We don't hear Him when He sighs, or we don't hear Him when He laughs. And so following Jesus in our culture, it means that we ascribe to a certain set of principles. Isn't that right? We have a certain set of beliefs that we hang on to. That's what it means to follow Jesus. Or we equate it with living a certain lifestyle. I don't do this and I do that because I'm a follower of Jesus, a certain lifestyle. And even in that, we have certain careers or certain vocations that we rank in order, okay? And if you're a follower of Christ, it's okay if you do this, but it's really good if you do that, and best if you do this. Anybody know what I'm talking about there? I guess maybe I'm talking there from my experience. My grandmother was an amazing woman of prayer. She just was an amazing, amazing person. She had 9 children, and I can remember her coming and staying at our house periodically. My grandfather had died when I was about 2, so I never really knew my grandfather. But my grandmother, as a widow, would make time between different children. Anne-Marie and I only have 3 children. We should have had a few more, Anne-Marie, so we'd have more houses to go to when we get old, okay? But she would come, and I remember getting up early in the morning, and as early as I had to, I suppose, as a kid, and seeing my grandmother kneeling beside her bed and praying. And then she would invite me to come in, and she had a bad back and bad knees, and so she would ask me to help her to stand, okay? So those are some of the memories that I have of my grandmother. Wonderful memories in that sense. But my grandmother also had this sense that there were certain vocations that were better than others, and so she had really taught her children this. And out of her 9 children, I think it was 8 of them had either been to seminary and were pastors or were married to pastors, okay? And I think it was her sense that was that's what it meant to follow Jesus. You could follow Jesus in this vocation, but to really follow Jesus, you needed to be in ministry, full-time Christian ministry. And I think that we misunderstand Jesus' words when we have that sense and when we limit what it means to follow Jesus simply to a set of beliefs or to a certain lifestyle or to a certain vocation. We miss out on what it truly means to follow Jesus. A number of years ago, there was this little saying, WWJD. Anybody remember that, huh? Anybody? Go ahead, shout that out. What would Jesus do? Right, okay. And it was kind of this catchy thing, okay, and people would wear it on those little wristbands before Lance Armstrong made his Live Strong famous, and it was a WWJD. What would Jesus do? And there was this idea that somehow or another, in any given situation, you would step into it, and you could ask yourself the question, now, what would Jesus do? Because we're to become like Christ. Isn't that right? Agreed? We're to become like Christ. The only problem with that, and again, I think there's wonderful things about that, and I think it's certainly a valid question to ask ourselves as we're in difficult situations. The only difficult thing with that is that if we're in a given situation, it kind of presupposes this idea that if we were to truly answer that question, what would Jesus do, then what Jack does in that situation, and what I do, and what Phil does, and what Scott does, and what Lexi does, what we do in that given situation would all be the same, right? Because it's what would Jesus do? And we just have to come across that magic answer. But I don't know if you know Jack very well, but Jack and I are very different. You can hear an amen to that one, right? And so sometimes the question isn't what would Jesus do? The question is, what would Steve do who has the power of Christ at work in him, do in that situation? The question isn't what would Jack do, but what would you do as you allow the Holy Spirit of God to work through you in that given situation? Because you see, following Jesus isn't about somehow or another stripping away our given personality. It's not about taking away our unique gifts and experiences. It's not about denying what's gone on in the past or stripping ourselves from all the dreams of the future. It's about being fully who we are with Christ who is at work in us. Isn't that right? There is this pressure in our culture to conform to a certain way of thinking, a way of doing life. Isn't that right? Paul speaks to us in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He says, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world." And so Paul is giving us this picture. It's this picture that there's this mold, and there's all sorts of pressure for you to conform to that particular pattern. But he goes on and he says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And here's the challenge for us sometimes in the church. We come out of the world and we come into the world, and what we don't realize is that even though there's pressure in the world to conform to a pattern, the church often replaces one mold with another mold, but yet still tries to squeeze people into now a slightly different mold, rather than allowing the work of God to renew our minds and to transform our character, so that we don't become clones of Jesus, but that our character becomes like His. And then Jesus goes on to say, anyone who tries to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. And so he puts this contrast between saving and losing our lives. And when he talks about saving our lives, trying to save our lives, what he's talking about there is just our natural condition. The natural human condition is to try to come to a place where we hang on to our lives. Where we try to sort through a way that in our own strength and in our own intellect and in our own goodness, we're able to chart our course through life, but then also determine a final outcome in our own strength, in our own wisdom, in our own self-sufficiency. And Jesus contrasts that with saving life. Now, so often we think of these words, saving our lives and losing our lives, and we think about that time in our life where we came to acknowledge our need for God. And it's a date way back there when we accepted Christ often. We just use different terminology to it, different phrases for it. But if you are a follower of Christ, you know what I'm talking about when I say there was a point in time where you came to acknowledge your need for God, right? And then you turned toward Him and received the gift of forgiveness that He offers. But here's the reality, is that oftentimes people come to that place where they acknowledge their need for God in that moment of salvation. And they receive that gift of salvation. But then as they go on in life, they say, thank you, Jesus, for the gift of salvation. Now I'll go back to living in my own strength. And in a sense, they take back their life. Take back their way of doing life. Take back their way of protecting themselves emotionally and psychologically and relationally. And they take back the control that they had yielded to Christ in that moment. Let me tell you about Sally. Okay, this isn't her real name, but Sally wanted to be a writer when she was growing up. In her late teens and early 20s, but she desperately wanted to be a writer. That was her passion. She loved to write. She loved to read, and so she wanted to go to college to be an English major, but her parents said, we're not financing an English major. What are you going to do with an English degree? And so they said, we want you to find something practical. And so she became an accountant instead. Her mom died when she was in her 20s. And her dad made it very clear that he needed her help with managing the house and helping with her younger siblings. And so she set aside her dreams in order to fulfill her responsibility and take seriously what it meant to honor her father. And over the years, she learned to pick up on her dad's signals about what he approved of and what he didn't. What she should act like, how loud she could be, what kind of interests she would have, what political views she had, what kind of guys she liked to date. And so she learned to pay attention to all of that. And in many ways, she built her life around her father's approval. And for her, denying herself meant letting go of her dreams. For her, taking up her cross meant accepting this course that her life had taken. I'm just taking up my cross. I'm just doing that thing that I need to do. And for her, following Jesus simply meant being willing to be obedient and to conform to what that her particular culture said a good girl, a good daughter would look like and act like. But recently she's begun to wonder if maybe she's misunderstood what it means to follow Jesus. Because she's in her 50s now and she doesn't really know just who she is. Or let me tell you about John. For John, achievement was the name of the game. He was just a natural-born leader. Everything that he seemed to touch, people would acknowledge that they would turn to him and they would allow him to lead them. Leadership came easy to him. He climbed the ladder within his company, became a vice president after a number of years. He came to Christ in his late 20s. And just as he had poured himself into his career, he also poured himself into the church. And he became involved in all aspects of the church. Anything worth doing was worth doing wholeheartedly for John. And so he was involved in the worship team, and he was involved with Sunday school, and he was involved with VBS. He was on the building committee. He was involved in the outreach to the community, and he was doing all these things. But of late, John has begun to find that he has lost his appetite for busyness. And even as he's trying to pull back, he's getting messages from all the people around him that there's still so much that needs to be done, and they desperately need his help. And after all, he has these gifts, and if he didn't use the gifts in God's church, in God's kingdom, then why would he have them? John would love to sit down and talk with a friend about the questions he has, the regrets that he has, the dreams that he has, but he doesn't even know where to start. Every relationship in his life has been built on doing things, getting stuff done. And he doesn't know how to get off the achievement train. You see, it seems to me that both John and Sally, they need to have a different understanding of what it means to deny themselves, a different understanding of what it means to take up their cross, and a different understanding, a little bit more nuanced understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. And so just in a couple minutes, and I've already touched on a number of these things, I'd like to just talk a little bit about just what it might mean for us to have a slightly different perspective on what it means to deny and to take up and to follow. Let's start with denying ourselves. Maybe rather than denying ourselves, and for us to equate that with saying no to our desires, maybe that simply means admitting our need for God. You see, one of our biggest temptations as people, and I touched on this before, is to try to do life our own way. Because it's so hard to trust other people, wouldn't you agree? We've all been hurt. We've all been wronged. And I totally agree with Mike when he says that God will never let us down, but I don't know that I agree with anybody who says that they've never been disappointed with God. Would you stay with me on that? There have been a lot of things in my life where I've had to say to God, God, I'm disappointed in what you have allowed into my life. Now, I know that ultimately, we'll look back and we'll see those things in a different light, and we will know that He has never released us, never let us fall, never let us down. But in the moment, there are a lot of times where I've been disappointed with God. And when we experience those hurts and those disappointments, oftentimes we find a way to protect our hearts from that disappointment simply by refusing to trust again. You see, if I don't trust people, then I can't be disappointed by them. It's when we trust, when we love, that we are actually opening our hearts up to being hurt or disappointed. And so my natural tendency is not to rely on other people, to become more and more self-sufficient, to be more and more capable, and to be more and more self-contained. But I think that denying myself means denying that particular way of life, and to become more honest about how just desperately I need God. About 4 weeks ago, my father was diagnosed with having a mass on his kidney. And we weren't sure exactly what it was like. We learned that it was large, probably about the size of 2 grapefruits put together. But I still didn't know exactly what was going on. He allowed me to see his medical chart, so I logged on, read the radiologist's report and all that, but they still didn't say in that report that it was inoperable, but that when he met with the urologist, that's what the doctor told him. This is inoperable, and your prognosis is not good because kidney tumors typically do not respond to chemotherapy, and so we're going to recommend something slightly different. My dad is 89, okay? Not completely unexpected, but he's 89, but pretty good health. Better memory than I have, okay? Very sharp mentally. So I talked to him. One of the good things about COVID has been that my family has actually gotten on Zoom, my siblings and my dad. Over this time, we've gotten on Zoom twice a month, every other week. And who would have thunk it, But it's what we're doing, and we've spent more time talking to each other since this, over this past year than we have probably in the 10 years before that. And so I said, Dad, how are you doing? How are you doing? And we'd talked about it, obviously, a little bit before, but he says, and he started to sing, and he says, here I am, standing in the need of prayer. He sings that hymn. And I said to my dad, Dad, I understand how you have a greater awareness of your need for God. But honestly, Dad, that's where we all are. We all desperately need God, isn't that right? You see, it's the crises in our lives that don't put us in a place of need for God. They just make our need for God, they make us aware of our need for God. If we were to face a difficult situation today, you get home, you hear about it this afternoon, are you in a greater need for God this afternoon than you are right now? I would suggest to you no, that you are in just as desperate of a need for God right now as you are this afternoon when that crisis falls upon you. It's just that crisis has highlighted your need for Him. And I think that denying ourselves means that we live with this ongoing awareness of our need for God. We choose not to insulate our perspective and our experience of life by somehow or another putting all sorts of things around us that go, okay, now I'm okay. My bank account is good. I just got a clean bill of health from the doctor. My relationships are all in order. There, I'm safe. I'm good. I'm comfortable. I think one of the hardest things for us to do is to live with this ongoing awareness of our need for God. But I think it's exactly what Jesus is talking about when he's saying that we must deny that tendency to declare that we are self-sufficient. And when it comes to taking up our cross, I do think that it means that we must face life and acknowledge life has its pain and be willing to enter into pain. But we must let go of our bias toward pain and instead hear the words, take up our cross, simply as obedience. When Jesus went to the cross, it wasn't because pain was somehow a preferred method. It was simply because he was obeying the directions of his Father. We must be willing to embrace obedience when it's hard and when it's easy. I think of marriage vows. I promise to love you and to be true to you in sickness and in health, right? For poorer and for richer. Now, what would it be like if you would enter into marriage and you'd say, I'm going to love you only in sickness, okay? And when we're poor, that's when I'm really going to love you, okay? And when things are really bad, that's when I'm going to love you. We'd say that's nuts. You have to understand that there is a breadth of experience in a marriage relationship, and so it is in our life with Christ. That there are times of pain, but there are also times of great joy. In Hebrews chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, who for the joy before him endured the cross. It's true that the cross was incredibly painful, excruciating at every level, not just physically. But woven into that experience, there was this joy for Jesus. Because it was through the cross that he would be able to look at us and he would be able to say, I no longer call you my servants, but I call you my friends. You are my sons and you are my daughters. I see you as my righteousness. You are my heirs. You are my treasures. Because of what will take place at the cross. I think we need to have a different understanding of what it means to take up our cross, and simply that it's this life of obedience in following Christ. And then when it comes to following Christ, I already gave you kind of a little bit of an image there. Rather than it simply conforming to a particular way of life, I think that following Christ needs to be bound up in staying close to Jesus, learning how to listen for him, learning to respond to him, learning to bring our entire self. And when we talk about our entire self, it means that we bring our past experiences, our present situation, our future dreams. We bring our personality and our gifts and our abilities into Okay, is that better? Okay. Don't you wish that we had battery gauges on our energy level sometime? Whoa, my battery just died. And so when it comes to following Jesus, we think about it more than just simply adopting a certain set of values or a certain lifestyle, but it really becomes all about learning how to stay close to him. I told you about Sally and I told you about John. Let me tell you about Megan, okay? Megan is a woman who has come through some incredibly difficult things in her life. But it was through those difficult things in her life that she came to an awareness of her need for God. And she turned to God. And as a result of that, she has established and entered into this relationship with God that is quite remarkable. She lives on a daily basis with an awareness of what he has brought her out of and what he has now given her. That she now receives from him absolute acceptance. That he sees her as righteous and whole, even though she's aware that there are all sorts of things in her life that are still in process. She has learned to experience the love of Christ. And because of that, she doesn't have to pretend that she's better than she is. She doesn't have to pretend that she's worse than she is. She can just be who she is. And she has convictions and beliefs, but she also understands that she doesn't see things with absolute clarity, and so she's a great listener. She has learned how to hear what other people are saying, even then when they can't say it as clearly as they would like. When people ask her to do things, there are times when she will pause and say, you know what, I need to take some time to think about this and pray about this, because rather I hear you asking me to do this, but I want to make sure that Jesus is asking me to do it as well. Other times, because she is so clear on what God has called her to do, she's able to say unequivocally yes or no, because it aligns with what she's already heard him saying to her. What's that mean? She's obedient, and she lives with this sense of joy, because even though there are difficult things that are taking place in her life, and I could list some of those for you, she has absolute confidence that God has brought her out, what God has brought her out of, and that God will see her through these situations. She's learned how to, quite honestly, embrace the gospel. Because you see, I think that's what it means to lose our lives. It means to embrace the gospel. And oftentimes we hear the gospel as this 4-point message, or this thing that Billy Graham said, but the gospel is simply these truths that acknowledge our need for God, God's willingness to extend forgiveness to us. And then this life of learning how to marvel at this new identity that he has given us. Once we were enemies of God, isn't that right? But now we are his friends, we are his sons, and we are his daughters. And in a relationship of depth, there are always new things to be discovered about that person, isn't that right? And so as we enter into this relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ, we're constantly learning, constantly experiencing new facets and aspects of his character and of his plan. And in the process of learning more about God, we learn more about ourselves. Isn't that right? We have the courage then to look at those inner parts of our being, those parts that we would just as soon deny and wish they didn't exist, as well as those parts of ourselves that are unexplored and maybe a little bit frightening or maybe a little bit mysterious, but those parts of ourselves that seem so complex that we just up to this point have said, I'm not even going there. I'm not willing to go there. It's too complicated. I'd rather live on the surface. Except God calls us into a deep relationship with him. And in order to be in a deep relationship with him, we must go to the deeper parts of our being. My prayer for you as a congregation, and my prayer for you as individuals, is that you will continue to grow in your understanding of what it means to deny yourself, what it means to take up your cross, and what it means to follow him. And that as you follow him, that you would experience this incredible joy of what it means to be in this intimate relationship with the King of the universe. Why don't you stand with me, and I'd love to pray for you.